Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. Are you having a good day? I hope it's a good day, or a good night, or a good morning, or a good middle of the night. Whenever you happen to be watching this, I hope you're having a good day. And I thought I'd take advantage of some sunshine since now that it's June, I have longer days. So when I get home from work, it's not dark, which is nice. I enjoy that. And I thought I'd get the intro done because I'm sure there are some people thinking, Missy, are you ever going to put together that pattern set that you posted? You talked about the fabrics. When are you going to sew them? So I have everything cut out, and that's what we're going to work on, some of the pieces. I don't know if we'll actually get to do all of the pieces in one video, so we'll probably just do a couple in this one. And whatever I can get through, once we change up the camera, then I'll adjust the title accordingly, and so you'll know with the thumbnail what we're going to do today. And so I have that ready. But before we start any of that, I just wanted to say a huge, huge, huge thank you, because I am totally blown away. I cannot believe you guys did it. You absolutely blew it out of the park. We are over 2,000 subscribers. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm speechless. I can't believe it. But I'm very, very tickled. I'm so happy about it. And I hope that the videos are helpful for you. I hope you're finding help and good ideas and ways to kind of branch off and do new things that maybe you haven't tried before. And maybe you all get to some things that I haven't tried before, and we'll just kind of learn together and go through the journey. But I sure enjoy seeing things that you've sewn. A lot of people are posting pictures of different things they're making in different Facebook groups. And so I get to see the pictures of your projects, and that is so fun. I enjoy that. Some people put them on Instagram, and they'll tag me. And so I love seeing your projects and the things that you've created. And some people even will take the patterns that I make and post and then change it up a bit, you know, and have fun modifying and taking something with no sleeves and add some sleeves, or cut the sleeves off, or lengthen the hemline, or whatever you want to do. But I'm tickled about that, and I'm so glad that it inspires people to try something that is a new adventure. So I'm so thankful that you're here, and we'll just keep going and see what happens. So I have lots of ideas. One of the ideas I thought of that I want to try is in response to a lot of questions that people have asked me. Usually it has to do with a pattern for a specific doll, which a lot of times I can't say because I don't have that doll, whatever it might be. And I know I get questions every once in a while, mostly about the Ippelhouse dolls, and I have to say I don't know, I don't have them. So I came up with an idea that I want to try, because a lot of times if you shop at different thrift stores, they get a lot of items in that have come from estate sales. And so there might be like a bulk of items that come in. And so like if you watch specifically for fabric trims, you know, like trimmings like laces and rickrack or odds and ends trims, or notions, some specialty odds and ends of fabrics and patterns. And I wonder if it isn't the estate sale kind of thing, because I was in and I found there was a whole pile of doll clothing patterns, but they were for like porcelain dolls, and I didn't know them. I wasn't familiar with them because I don't collect porcelain dolls, but I did like a lot of the designs, and so I went ahead and bought the patterns because they were 25 cents. And so a lot of times you can find patterns like that you really like the design, and I thought we would do an experiment on how to take one of those patterns and use it for yada yada yada, whoever you might have. So that's one of my little things, because it was a really pretty 1800s maybe walking dress. So it has the bustle and all the layers and all the ruffles and pleats and all the fun things. And I thought, well, I don't have that doll, but I have others. And I want to see if I can adjust that and modify it to make it fit the doll that I want to dress. So that will be an adventure coming up soon. And so be on the lookout if there's something you find that you think, I think I could try this, and maybe go in tandem with that video and see what you can do. I would love to just make them free for everybody, but unfortunately when I buy patterns like that, they are copyrighted, so I can't just repost them. Some of them I can check the date and check on like fair use laws and see if they're old enough that I could post them without any copyright infringement because they're so old. But I don't even know what the schematics are on all that kind of stuff. So I can just recommend that if you're shopping at thrift stores, check out the patterns and keep your eye out for old pattern sets like that, that maybe somebody, you know, great grandma used to sew these things, and now we're taking a bunch of those old things that have been handed down and nobody's used them to the thrift store. So you might be able to find something like that, and then we can in turn turning into something new. I will post anything that I revert to a doll pattern for my doll, because now it's my pattern, that I will happily post. But a lot of times I can't post the original pattern. So I know you understand about that. But that's just an adventure I thought we could try. So just still some ideas coming down the old noggin, and we'll try them and see if we can create fun things. Okay, so now to our project. I have cut, oh goodness, did I cut out stuff? I got to cutting, and I actually cut out enough pieces to do 2 full Mori sets. So I get carried away when I start cutting. And so we have, and in the video where we looked at fabrics, I really liked that salmony peachy color, had the right feel, but when I laid it next to a lot of the fabrics that I had and that I purchased, it just didn't have the same vibe, so I'm not going to use that. But I am going to probably sew up one of the items that I'll do on camera, and then when we get it done, I'll show both of the items, because I cut out enough to do 2 shirts. So we'll sew one shirt on camera, but then I'll show you both of the shirts when we get to the end of the project. So probably today we're going to put together the leggings. Let me think here. The leggings and the shirt, and then later we might get to the jumper. Then in the next video, probably the sweater and the little shoe things and the vest. Maybe. I'm just thinking we'll do the first layer so that we can get her with some clothes on. And then we'll go for the outer layers. So we'll switch up the camera and start sewing. The first item we're going to put together is the top, and I have chosen the beautiful lace for the top, and yes, it is completely sheer with really big holes in it, and especially this little line here, which is mostly just some threads holding those 2 layers together. And so what I've done is I took some Fray Check, which, if you're not familiar with it, it looks like this. It's in the Sewing Notions aisle, and it keeps fabric from fraying along the edges. Now, it is kind of like a glue, so you kind of have to be prepared for that. And what I did is I found some paper, and this is just a movie club, but it's kind of a slick paper, and so I laid the pieces on this paper in order to put the fray check around the edges. And then I was able to very carefully, after it dried, to pull it up. And let's see if we can get this to show against the edge of my finger. Let's see, I'll grab my tweezers, get the paper out of the way. Right here, you can just see a little bit of the residue of the glue. And so it actually makes, it kind of reminds me of the edge of a tablet. You know how they put the, like the rubbery glue on the edge that holds the paper there, and then you just pull the paper off? That's kind of what it reminds me of, just so you have a frame of reference. But it's going to keep all these edges from fraying. Now, it will be a little stiff because it's kind of glued those edges in place, but it's kind of just the nature of the beast. It's what it does, and it keeps that edge together so that you have something to sew. The other thing I am going to do with this is I have some Fusible Interfacing, and so it looks like this, and I don't know if this will show up either, but Fusible Interfacing, if you can see, it has like tiny, 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 tiny little dots. Let's see if I can get closer and if it'll show. Hopefully it will. And those little tiny dots are iron-on adhesive. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to just clip a couple pieces off of here. Let's see if we can just take, I've already got some where I cut out, so that'll work. There we go. I just want a little snippet. And what I'm going to do, along with the fray check, is I'm going to cut just a little tiny bit. I mean, just literally a tiny, tiny little bit. And I'm going to iron on a little tiny bit just at the shoulders, because you can see, against my finger hopefully, right here, there's several spaces where there is no fabric just because of the way the lace lays. So I'm going to use some of this Fusible Interfacing, and I'm only going to put it on so that it covers the seam allowance and just a tiny bit more, so that I will actually have something that I can sew that will go all the way across for those shoulder seams. And I'm only going to do it at the shoulder just because that's what's going to get a lot of pull as you put it on the doll. It's going to rest there. And so I wanted to have something that would actually substantiate where my seam is going to be. So I have something to sew. And so I might even cut this so it's not even that wide. We can make it thinner. I can actually get 2 out of this. And it's just going to give me fabric that will actually be able to feed through the machine and help hold my lace together as a fabric, and then it will be in the seam allowance, so it's going to be fine. But I'm going to do that on the shoulders, and that way I have something that's ready to be put together, and will just help that in my process. So I'm going to do that to all 4 shoulders, so you know what I'm doing there. And then I'm going to put the front and the back together at the shoulders. So it'll be like this. And once I have that ironed on, and oh, here's a good example again of that glue right there. So it is holding those little laces up, but that fray check and the little iron-on interfacing is going to help that. So it's going to give me an edge that I can actually sew together, because as you can see, if I didn't have that, all I'm going to have is threads here. So I'm not even going to have fabric to do my seam without that Fusible Interfacing. So that's why I'm going to do it on this. Then most of the other places, because of the length and where it is, it's going to fall to where I'll actually have something I can sew. But just if you're working with a lace like this, that you think, well, once I got it cut out, there's no fabric there. It's just string. So that's what I'm going to do to help this go together better. Then on the sleeves, I picked where I wanted the sleeve to lay when I was actually cutting the lace. So these sleeves will not be hemmed at all, and they're going to have this beautiful little fray as part of the hem, and then I went ahead and kept this little embellishment here so that as it hangs, that's what's going to be on the sleeves. So I thought that would be really pretty. And then this bit that's actually more substantial will give a little bit of weight so that that drape will hold off the shoulders. So I think that'll hang really nice. And so I'm going to go ahead and baste one line along the shoulder edge so I can have a little bit of easement and gathering to fit that into the armhole. So I'm going to be basting across the top of the shoulders, and I'll get these shoulders put together, and then I'll come back to the camera. Now I thought I'd show you what those seams look like. So you can see it's just a little bit of that interfacing on the seam. And what I'm going to do to help that stay put is I'm going to lay the whole seam allowance towards the back, and then I'm going to top stitch that. So on the shoulders it'll look like this. So it'll be a little bit of a, you'll be able to see that there's something underneath there, but it's going to be on the back of the shoulder, and it'll be top stitched in place. And then I may go ahead and just trim a tiny little bit so it's not quite as wide, but that's going to help that stay in place and help my lace not to ravel, and it gives my machine something to actually sew. So that's how that's going to look. It's going to hold together really well, and I'm very pleased with how that works. So that's just a little tip if you're dealing with something that there's not much there. In some of these instances, you can use a little bit of that fusible interfacing, and like I say, the adhesive will also help keep your lace from fraying as well, but just the combination of that Fray Check and that interfacing is going to keep that sturdy on the shoulders, where we're going to be attaching sleeves and attaching things for a neckline. It's just going to give it a little bit more durability. So that's just kind of a helpful hint if you're working with a very fragile fabric like this. So I'll go ahead and top stitch this edge on the shoulders, trim that out just a tiny bit. Then I've went ahead and basted the sleeve shoulder line, and so we can take, and I hope my hand's not just in the way, we can take the thread here, if we just grab one, and I usually will just kind of pucker up the shoulder line, and then when I go to put it into the armhole on the garment, I start at the outside edges and keep it as flat as I can as I match that up to the armhole, so that most of the gathering is right at the shoulder. So that way it puts all the little puff and ruffle up at the top of the shoulder. So I'll kind of ruffle it up so it's clearly smaller than the armhole, and then I'm going to start at each edge, get that pinned in place, and then just kind of stretch it out and pull it as I fit it to the armhole opening, so that I leave all the little puckering up at the shoulder. Because a lot of times when I make something, I know I'm going to have some gathers at the shoulder, and I want to have a little bit more room in that fabric. So the sleeve shoulder line is not, in this pattern, not going to match perfectly to the shoulder opening on the garment, because it's bigger, because I wanted some puff at the top. So that's kind of how I lay that in there. So I'll kind of grab one of these here for an example, even though I haven't top stitched this down yet. So on the good side of the fabric, I will be laying the sleeve opening, and I'll take the one edge and pin it here, just for sake of example here, or you can clip, whatever you're more comfortable with. Then the other edge, and this fabric is very floppy because it's very delicate. There we go. And we'll do that to the other edge of the arm opening and line that up and put a pin or a clip here on this side. There we go. Then, as you can see, I've got threads in the way, that's what you can see. There we go. Now I will gently smooth this out as I go along the seam edge from under the arm and start up towards the shoulder, smoothing that fabric out so that it's nice and flat. There we go. Because I don't want a bunch of puckers under the arm, you know what I mean? So we're going to smooth that out as I go towards the shoulder. So there we go. We'll get another pin. Smooth that one. Let's see. Now I start with the other side. And be sure and use some lotion. I tell you what, from working, I work with a lot of polynet foam and fiber-filled batting at work. And I tell you what, it just really sucks the moisture right out of your hands. So my hands tend to get very dry, and around my fingernails gets like little hangnails, and oh my goodness, it can snag fabric. So if you have that battle as well, be sure you're using lots of good hand lotion before you work with some of these fabrics, because boy, they tend to want to catch on my fingers all the time. So now, if I've stretched out a little too far, I can grab my thread again from my gathering and give it a little tug on the thread, add some gathers, so I can keep this all flat where I've pinned, and then have those gathers right up to the top and fit that to the shoulder seam, and then I'm ready to go ahead and sew that in. So that's kind of how I work with a sleeve that's a little bit bigger than the arm opening. And I always start from the outside and work in, smoothing it out, because that puts all those wonderful little ruffles and puff right up at the top of my shoulder seam where I want them. And then I don't end up with, you know, puckers and tucks down here under the arm, or like right at the edge that would be kind of like level with the bust line. I don't want any puckers there. I don't want gathers there. I want them all up on the shoulder. So that's kind of how you lay it in there. So I'm going to work on getting that done, and then we'll come back to the camera. I thought I would just come back to the camera just for a second before I actually put this sleeve in. I have it all pinned in here. So I've smoothed it from this end and this end with just a little bit of puckering up at the top, at the shoulder seam. And so it's all pinned and ready to go. I thought I would mention, because I like to just share little things that might help you, especially if you're new to sewing and you've got your first sewing machine, and so you're just experimenting and learning and having a great time. If you have something that's gathered a little bit like this, one thing that might be helpful for you is when you actually put this through the machine, put the side that has the puckers or the gathers down. So when I feed this through the machine, the sleeve that has the puckers in it is going to be on the bottom. And the reason for that is that a lot of times your feed dogs will help that go through the machine and help pull that through. And so you'll end up with a more even gather and an even lay. If you take whatever piece is bigger that needs a little help to feed through your machine, put it on the bottom, because that way your feed dogs are gonna, and that's these little pieces down here that actually move with the fabric and help pull the fabric through the machine. It's going to help your material go through more evenly if the bigger part, or the part with the gathers, is on the bottom. Those are going to help feed that through the machine. So it's just a little helpful tip that I hope will make your easing things through there a little bit more helpful. And then also, because the sleeve is going to have gathers, you know, at the top, but the place where you really don't want any puckers is going to be on the bodice of the garment. And so this way, as you're feeding it through the machine, the feed dogs are going to help take that gathered part through, plus you can actually see the top part that you want to remain flat, and you can kind of mitigate some of those problem areas as you're going around something, because you can see it. If it's on the bottom, a lot of times you can't see that something is puckered where you don't want any puckers at all, but then you don't see it because it's on the bottom. So that might just help as you're feeding items through your machine. Also, if you're sewing and you're wanting things to lay kind of flat, as you go through your machine, and let's see if I can explain this, don't feel like you're having to sew around curves, but as you feed it through the machine, bring everything as a straight line through the machine. Kind of fool your machine into thinking you're sewing a straight line, and that will kind of help as you feed it through there. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. Since I have this all pinned and ready to go, I guess we'll go ahead and feed it through here. I wasn't going to show all my sewing just because sometimes that makes the video really long. But we're going to go ahead, since I have it all laid out here, and I am going to do a couple back tack stitches just because this can tend to come apart because it's not a very sturdy fabric, obviously, and I want that to kind of be anchored. So here as I go through, I'm going to, and it has a definite curve here, I'm going to be kind of angling it so that my machine is like, oh, we're sewing a straight line here. So that's kind of how I'm going to feed this through. And here I can see my top, and that way, like even this little seam allowance that I have laying one direction, I can actually make sure it hasn't bent backwards and turned the wrong way. And I'm going to just remove these little pins as I get to them. See, now here's, oh, it's a perfect example. Let's see if I can move the camera in. Here we go. We're gonna jostle that in there. Hopefully this will show, and I'll grab my tweezers. Right here you can see this little seam allowance. See how it's, I want it to lay that direction, but you can see how it's being bent towards me because of the foot. So since I have this on top, I'm going to put the camera back. There we go. But since I have this on top, I can see that. So now, with my needle sunk, it enables me to lift my foot, which, pardon me if it snaps back down, I need some repair on my machine. But now, I can lift my foot and then make sure that seam allowance is going the right direction before I sew over it, simply because I had it on the top where I could see it. So a lot of times you'll save yourself some headaches just by placing things into your machine a certain way. And so here we're coming towards the edge. I'm going to lift my foot because I'm going to, once again, fool this little machine into thinking this is just a straight line coming through here. That's all. We're just sewing straight lines. No, little machine, we're not sewing curves on tiny doll clothes. We're just sewing a straight line, and that's all we're doing. So there we go. And take out the last one. We're going to come right to the edge, back tack just a little bit to anchor that. There we go. Let's take that out. Okay, and now I can go ahead and trim these threads because I did back tack and anchor that. Trim them on both sides. Trim away. Now if you want to pull out that basting, you can. This is white and it should be inside the seam allowance, so I'm probably not going to worry about it. Now, what I usually do, just because I like the way it looks, is I will take this shoulder edge of the seam allowance and run it through the serger machine because I like the way it finishes the edge, and that will also help hold all this lace in place. The other thing you can do is a little zigzag stitch if you want to just anchor that a little bit better, get those seam allowances to be completely anchored together, and then you can trim outside the zigzag if you've got any extra fabric. Just be careful that you don't take the zigzag past your seam allowance, and that's a nice way to finish that edge if you want. So I'll do that and then I'll come right back. And here is how that little sleeve is laying inside the armhole. I don't have any puckers or tucks on the actual bodice, and I think that is just going to be beautiful when it's done. So there we go. So now I will follow that the same steps for the other sleeve, and then we'll come back to the camera. Now both the sleeves are in, and I am just loving how this is going to turn out. And so the next question is how we want to do the back and the neckline. So on the very back, what I'm going to do is, let's see if we can put this together here, is I'm just going to line up with right sides together. Had it wrong way there. And there we go. And I'll do a seam that will go from the bottom where the hem would be, probably up past this part that has just threads here, and right just above that, so that I have the entire neck opening and, what is that, about 2.5, 3 inches of back opening, so I can get it over the doll's head. And so I'll anchor that and just have a back seam and then press that open. But for the neckline, we're going to look at a couple ways that you can do this. So I have some scraps here, because on the lace it would be really hard to show. So if you're going to use like a bias binding, because it is a curve, so a bias tape is going to work as a nice binding. One thing you need to realize is this is it called triple fold? So where it's like this when you buy it and then you unfold it. So it has a fold here and then a fold in the middle. Or maybe this isn't, maybe it's just double. Anyway, it's the 1/2 inch kind. If you unfold the edge and line it up on your fabric and sew along that inner fold, this is what's going to happen. So we'll show that. And a lot of people would just do this. They're like, oh, okay, we're going to use some bias tape and just put it on. So remember, this blue line is the seam line. So what can happen is, let's see here, if I can get it to line up. We'll line it up there. We're just going to sew, and we're going to match the edge of the bias tape with the edge of the fabric. And we're just going to go around the corner, and this is a little less than a 1/4 inch, so my blue will probably show. But that's okay, because it's going to be good to illustrate what's happening here. So we go around the edge, and again I'm kind of unfolding the bias as I go along, and I'm bringing that curve, hope my hand's not totally in the way, into the machine as if I was just sewing a straight line, making sure I don't have any pleats or tucks. There we go, and we're getting around to the edge. There we go. Okay, here we come. And I'm not going to worry about back tacking anything, since this is just for the sake of throwing my scissors. There we go, some entertainment for you. So, alright, and we'll trim off what we don't need of this bias tape. So now we've sewn it on. So what a lot of people would do is like, oh, and it's a curve, so we're going to snip the edge of that seam allowance, since we have a curve going on there. Now, a lot of folks would just take that bias tape and try to wrap it around the edge of the fabric. Here we go. Like so. And around the edge of that seam allowance. And so we can do that, just for sake of illustration. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bias tape and go up and wrap it around that seam allowance and then sew it down. And we'll start the machine, sink my needle. Okay. And make sure it's wrapped all the way around that seam allowance fabric. And wrapping it around. Now if you sew very much, I'm sure you're already guessing what's going to happen by doing it this way. So here we go, we're almost to the end here. And once again, I'm not going to worry about back tacking because this is just kind of a little teaching item and it's not going to be an actual garment. Okay, so what we've done is we've trimmed this out, and so now it's nice and finished, and it does look nice. But now, as you'll see, the neckline opening is the same as it was. So we've finished the edge, but we haven't actually made this seam allowance, which is the neckline, the width of the opening. So we've finished it, but we still have a very small neckline, which if you want to do that, that's totally fine. But if you want the seam line to be the actual opening of the neckline, you're going to have to do a different type of finishing. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and clip this. Here we go. Now there's a couple of different ways you can do it. One is to just cut this off, cut the seam allowance off, and then finish it exactly like we did this one, and that would take your neck opening to this actual seam line. The other way is to, and it's going to sound kind of weird, but is to take the seam binding or the bias tape and just cut off one edge. So here I'm going to cut off, and fortunately, since it's doll clothes, a lot of your openings aren't as big as on people clothes, so it won't take forever to trim this off. But you can cut along one of the folds. There we go. Okay, and discard that little piece. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this newly cut edge, and that's what we're going to sew along the edge of the fabric. So this time we'll start again. Okay, and again we're going to sew that right along the edge, but this time we're using that freshly cut edge that would have been inside the fold. And some people that are masters might sew along the inside of the fold, but for me it's just hard to see, I guess, if you did it from the other side of the fabric. But there we go. Okay, so then we can sew that. Cut this off because we don't need that part. Now what will happen is when you fold this over, rather than wrapping the seam allowance, we're literally going to fold the seam allowance all the way back like this, so that the edge is the seam that we just made. I'll start at this end because that way I can fit it into my machine easier. So, and you might want to even trim that seam allowance a little bit so that it won't show, because sometimes it's hard to get it perfectly even. So let's go from this side, and you'll be able to see. I'm just going to trim this down to like 1/8 of an inch. And I want to get the little folded part out of the way, because I don't want to trim that little folded part. I'm only trimming the seam allowance of what I sewed. Hopefully my hand's not totally in the way. My camera's kind of off to the side, so I can't readily see a monitor or anything with what's on the screen for you guys. Alright, there we go. So here we go. Now we're going to trim that off. Okay, good. So with the seam binding now sewn on and the little seam allowance trimmed, now I'm going to fold this seam binding back along the actual seam line, and I'm going to kind of cover up the seam allowance inside the new little fold that's left after I trimmed it. So let's get that so the fold kind of overlaps that little bit of seam allowance, and it won't overlap very much. But now I'm going to, with that inside, turn this and sew so that I'm pulling that binding just enough to where, let's see if we get close, the actual edge of the white fabric is showing, because I don't want the seam binding to show on the front. I just want it to look like the edge of the fabric. So now we'll put this in the machine. I apologize if my hand's in the way. This is so tiny, and I'm going to sink my needle, there we go, to kind of hold it in place. And now as I sew on the seam binding, really close to the seam, I'm bringing it around, folding it so that I can actually see a bit, just a tiny bit, of that front fabric. And it's not like folding it down over a lot, it's just so that my seam binding will be totally on the inside of the garment and not poke out above the edge so that you can see it from the outside. So we'll see how I do here. And I'm going to adjust my foot a little bit if I need to. Just on this one little corner. It's kind of hidden under the foot. Okay, and around the corner we go. And we're getting to the end. We'll go ahead and pull it out and trim it. So here's the inside. And we'll get rid of these threads too. All these little threads kind of drive me crazy. So I like to trim them off. So here is the inside. And you can kind of see where that little tiny edge of the front fabric kind of shows. So now when we turn it around, all that seam binding is on the inside. And what we've done is now the actual seam line that was where the pen line was, is the outline of the neckline. So that's just a couple different ways. If you want to use a binding, you can do it. Now, like I say, if you want this width for your opening, but you still want the seam binding to show, you would just cut along the actual seam line and then do it the way we did the first one. The other option, of course, and let's see if I can, we'll just, we're just going to do it on the bottom of here. Let's see, we'll create a new neckline here. That's easy enough to do. And then the third way that you can finish this, if you like, we'll put on our seam allowance here, just so we can see, is, and this depends on your fabric and how comfortable you are with how it's going to work with you. And this is the method I might actually use on the lace one, just because I don't want to add more bulk with the binding because it's such a fragile fabric. But what you can do is stay stitch along the actual seam line, and I'm just drawing it on here so you can tell where it would be. You wouldn't necessarily have to draw on your seam line, but this is just for the sake of illustration. So you can stay stitch along that seam line, and that just creates a little bit of stability in your fabric, because what you're going to do now is all these little tabs on the wrong side of the fabric, you're just going to fold them back along that seam line, the stay stitching. Here we go. We'll just fold them over, and that's why you need to clip is because we're going to be sewing this back, and we're simply hemming it. We're just going to turn those little tabs to the wrong side and go very close to the stay stitching. And this method, like I say, kind of depends on your fabric, and you can even make it a smaller seam if you want. If you want to just do, instead of a 1/4 inch, do 1/8 of an inch. Here I have a little bit more curve that I haven't clipped there. Add that in there so we can get around that corner. But the clips allow you to, or the little snips in the fabric allow you to open those up, and they can separate as they're going around that curve. And this will just add a simple hem, and the little pieces of fabric will be just trimmed and sewn around, and then you get a pretty flat open neckline. And so those are just a few ways that you can finish the neckline. So if you want to add the binding to show, you would do the first method like this, where you sew it on and you fold the binding over the seam allowance and then stitch it down, and that gives you a binding that shows, like a little edge here. If you don't want it to show, you can trim off that one little fold and sew the cut edge along the fabric. Then as you wrap it around, you're actually going to fold it back at the actual seam line that connects those two pieces, and then tack it down on the inside, making sure that you pull it enough to where it's not going to show. Or, oh, it's on the other side, simply do a stay stitching on the neckline and trim, because you can see as these little tabs separated, that's because they're going the opposite direction on that curve now. And then just sew those little tabs down as you go around it. If you have a very stretchy fabric, you might need not trim or snip as many times if your fabric is stretchy enough for those to open the opposite direction. But then that's going to give you a finished neckline that does not have any trim on it, which is what I may attempt on this, just because I don't think I want to add binding to this fabric. So there we go. There's a quick little tutorial on necklines and bindings and how you can use them. And now look at this. I could make this into some little underwear. I don't know. Anyway, so what I think I'm going to do is the stay stitching method. And because there's so many holes in this, I'm thinking I might be able just to go around it and call it good, and then finish up the back. And then once that part is done, we'll be ready to do the side seams. So here's the neckline. I am very happy with how it turned out. I simply very carefully went around the edge, just turning it over with those little snips. And because of the type of lace that it is, I'm happy with that, because it doesn't look like there's been a lot of bulk added to the neckline, which is what I wanted. I wanted it to look just finished, but not like I'd added anything to this fabric, because it's just so delicate. So when I was going around the edge and starting at the neckline, I did want to mention that I took the back edge and folded the back edge in before I turned it over to do the hem, because now I'm going to turn it with right sides together, and I will be stitching the back from the hem up towards the neckline, but I'm going to leave that bit open, so I'm only going to sew about to here. And then when that seam allowance is done, because of the way the seam allowance will fall, then these will naturally fall as a fold, because this will be sewn so it will lay like this. So on the outside of the garment, I'll have a finished edge, and I may even just stitch that edge down so that I've got like a folded finished edge there. But that's why I did folded that in and then turned the hem down, just so I'd have a finished edge there. So I'll do the back up to about the midway and anchor it, because that's going to be a place where there's more tension on the fabric, just because you're putting it on and off the doll, so there's more pull there. Then when that back seam is done, I will lay it out still with right sides together, inside out, and I'm going to sew from, let's see, make sure those are in the view of the camera. I'm going to sew from the hem of the sleeve to the underarm and down the side. And then, other than a little snap at the top, this will actually be finished. Because of the way the lace is, I'm not worrying about hemming the bottom. I'm just going to let it fall. And with the curved hem, when I come down to the sides, I'm going to stop sewing and anchor about an inch from where the curve starts in, so that that will separate just a little bit at that curved part. I'm not going to sew all the way, you know, down the curve. I'm going to stop above where the curve is. So we'll go ahead and get this part finished up and then put it on the doll and see how it looks. So here's the little top on the doll. I put on just a little black bodysuit so we could show off the lace and how it hangs. And so yeah, the sleeves have a real pretty little drape, exactly what I wanted with this fabric. And without any actual hemming on it, it hangs really nice, and there's nothing that's making it, you know, stiff or to stand out. So here's the edge of it, and I just trimmed. I may actually cut just a little bit more fanciful edge on a couple of these parts here now that it's finished, but I like the little scallop in the front. And the neckline is pretty much just what I wanted. It doesn't look bulky or like we've added a lot to it. And we'll swing it around. Oh, there we go, back up my camera. I haven't put the snap on yet, but here's what the back looks like. And of course the doll stand is going to kind of pull on that, but I'll add the snaps up here at the back, just one snap. And because of just the way we finished that, it doesn't add a lot of bulk, you know, and you don't have a huge bulky seam allowance showing there. It looks very simple, and so I'm very happy with how this turned out. So the next thing we're going to tackle is the lace leggings, which will be pretty simple. So we'll put the camera back on its stand and start the leggings. These leggings are going to be super, super simple because of the doll's shape. She has a lot more fullness through the hips than a lot of my other dolls, but her little rump and tummy aren't that defined, so they're still pretty flat. There's just more room in the actual hips of the doll, and so I didn't want to have leggings that would be very, very bulky at the waist, just enough to accommodate her hips. So a lot of times you'll see a pattern, and we're going to overlap this just a little bit, that will look kind of like this. So it's all, let's see if it's shown in the camera here. So it's all one piece. You know, it'll come up and across and down. But when that happens, if this width is wide enough for the hips of the doll, it's going to be similar unless this comes in substantially. It's going to have more bulk here. But I wanted more narrowness at the waist, but I wanted an actual curve at the hips to fit this particular doll. So that's why there's 4 pieces. And because the front of the doll and the back of the doll aren't that different from one another as far as how poochy they are, I guess, for lack of better terms, there's not really a front and a back piece. It's just one piece, and you cut 4 of them. And so we're going to sew the pieces together to, you know, make the leggings, and they're all going to be the same. So the first step is to identify on this lace which is my wrong side and right side. So I've matched the pieces, so I have right side to right side. And the first step we're going to do is on each set of 2, we're going to sew from the waist down on the outside edge. So that's going to be our first step. And then once that is done on both of these, we're going to hem the leg just down here on the hem. So that's going to be the first step, is simply sew down the side to the hem and hem each one, and then sew down there and hem that one. So we'll do that, and then I'll come back. Now our sides are put together, and as you can see, if you lay it on here, there we go, there's a little pucker right here in the center, which is what I wanted to allow for just the extra fullness in the hips of the doll that I have. So, and then I just turned up just a little over 1/4 inch and hemmed that. This lace isn't going to fray. It's kind of not like a woven. It's more of a like a pressed lace, I guess. So if you cut it, it's not going to fray. So I didn't worry about serging the edges, and I just pressed this seam open and then pressed them. So it's pretty simple, and not a lot of work on this kind of lace. So now with the right sides together, now that I have this seam done, the next step is going to be on each of the sides to sew the inseam. So I'm going to sew from the hem up to the crotch here, and then I'll do the same on this one from the hem up to the crotch, and then we'll go ahead and do the next step. Now that these are sewn, I do like to take, I want some different scissors, and just trim just the corner of that seam allowance where the hem is, just so that I don't have kind of a blocky edge of those sticking out from underneath there and showing on the outside. So I do like to trim that. So now to put the leggings together, we're going to take one of the legs here, and we're going to turn it right side out, like so. And then we're going to take the one that is right side out, and we're going to funnel it into the one that is wrong side out, and kind of just stick the leg down in there. And you can kind of sometimes reach up from the bottom too and get a hold of that other leg. So there we go. And I like to pull it out so it's a little bit longer, just so I can get everything straight and kind of flattened. And then once I kind of have it lined up so that the inseam is lined up and then the outer seam is kind of lined up, I can kind of flatten it. And then I'm going to pull that back up so that those hems are even. And now what we're going to do is we're going to sew the crotch seam. And to do that, I, excuse me, I open up the seam allowance on the crotch seam, the inseam right there at the bottom of the crotch, and I open up that seam allowance, and I'm going to pin where those seams will match. So that's where I've put the first pin. It's like so. There we go. Then I come up one side from that pin and just make sure my side is, my edges are lined up. There we go. And because these, like I say, it's the same piece, the front and the back is not going to matter because it's exactly the same. So then I do the other side and I match those edges. And this fabric is real simple to work with, so I'm just going to use the 3 pins. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the waist edge up here, and I'm going to sew down to the inseam and then back up the other side. And let's see if can get that in there. And this part I am going to film just because sometimes, and especially if you're sewing on a smaller scale than this 3rd scale, it can be a little challenging to do this. So what I'm going to do is, as I move down the seam here, I'm trying to keep my fingers out of the way, I'm going to continually be adjusting the fabric and moving my leg over, because again, I'm trying to fool my machine into thinking I'm just sewing a straight line. I'm not sewing a curved crotch line, but I'm taking this fabric that I've already sewn and bringing it forward, just so that I've got more to work with as I move down the seam. So now I'm right at that inseam, and I'm making sure all the seam allowances are open. And once again, I'm going to adjust this and turn my leg so that I've got more to work with as I come down. And then I continue sewing. And now you can see it kind of flipped around there, and because now I'm coming up the other side. And then when I get to stop, I'm going to do a little bit of a back tack. There we go. We'll take it out. And that's how I kind of do the crotch seam. But by manipulating your fabric kind of around, it just kind of makes it easier to, because you're sewing, you know, this little shape, a horseshoe shaped line. And so then that's what your seam will look like. So the next thing now is to take the leg from the inside and pull it out. So we'll do that like so. And then the one that is wrong side out, we're going to turn right side out. And voila, now we have a pair of leggings. So the last thing we need to do is to put in the elastic. And I'm glad these are laced, because it'll kind of help me as I'm showing what we're doing, because you can kind of see through it, so that'll be helpful. So this pattern, a lot of times I'll just fold over, and if it's a fabric that's not going to fray, I just, you know, sew the edge because it's not going to fray anyway. But this one, I wanted it to be a little bit more finished, so I'm going to turn it over, and I'm right at the seam, the back seam or the front seam. They're the same one. So and I'm going to fold over 1/4 inch, making sure that that seam, the back seam, is open. Then I'm going to fold again, not quite a 1/2 inch, so more like 3/8 of an inch, I guess. And I'm going to pin that like so. There we go. And then I'm going to go to the front or the back, whichever is the opposite for you. And I'm going to open that seam allowance. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to fold down about 1/4 inch. And then about not quite a 1/2 inch. There. And I'm going to pin that. I'm making sure that seam allowance was open. So I'll put a pin there. Now I'm going to go to one of the side seams. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to fold it in 1/4 inch, and then another, and I'm opening that seam allowance. There we go. About 3/8 of an inch, or a little less than 1/2 inch there. And pin that one. And now to the last side seam, and the same thing again. Now the reason I do these 4 seams is now I don't really have to worry a lot about the space between them, because if I give this a gentle little tug, because it's rolled up so close together, that seam allowance that's in here is automatically going to kind of roll up into place. So you don't really have to worry. If you just give a little tug, that's going to get that evened out and hold it in place for you. So then I'm going to start at the back, and I always start my seam, just because there's bulk in that seam allowance, I always start my seam a little bit to one side of the seam allowance. So my seam is here and the open seam allowance is here, and it's kind of bulky in there. So I'm going to start sewing the casing right about here. And I'm going to do a tiny little back tack just to hold it secure, because I'm going to be working threading elastic through there. And then I'm going to sew very close to the edge of the casing, just all the way around. Okay, so we're going to sink the needle and do just a couple little stitches and a back tack, a couple little stitches just to hold that in place. All right, now we're going to start going around. Take this pin out because my needle is holding that in place. And I'm not going to pull real tight. I'm just giving it kind of a little tug to make sure my fabric is rolled under in there and create that nice little finished casing. And then again, as I did with that crotch seam, I'm bringing my fabric forward as I move along the seam. So I'm going to come to the next pin and pull it out, which is at a side seam. And so over that, and come around this way. Now again, and you want to be careful that your pins aren't coming out. I'm going to roll this and bring this forward. And there's this little, the screw knob that holds the foot on. I like to kind of use that to hold my edge up, and then it keeps it out of the way of the foot so that it's not catching. There we go. I have that one a little bit narrow, so we're going to pull that back down. Okay. Continue to the next side seam. Then I'll stop, and again I'm bringing that forward just over the top of this little guy, kind of keeping it anchored but yet away from the foot and away from my needle that's going up and down. So then we'll come across here, roll it again and bring that forward. And like I say, I hope these little tips are helpful, especially if you're just new and starting to sew. Sometimes it's helpful to have some of those little hints, you know, on how to make your machine work for you in the easiest way possible. So that's my goal. Okay, so now as we come around, let's see if it'll show on my camera. Here's my thread, which shows that my sewing started right here. So I'm going to sew and leave about a 1/2 inch opening. So I'm going to do a back tack right about here, because that's going to leave a space for me to insert my elastic. So we're going to come around, and I can see where I started sewing. So right about here, we're going to back tack just a little bit and pull that out. Okay, and then I'll trim my threads so I don't have any of those threads hanging in the way. Okay, so now I've pre-cut my elastic, and what I usually do is I wrap it around the doll with a 1/2 inch overlap at the waist, and then I know that that'll stretch over the hips. And so that's what I do with this doll in particular, because her hips are pretty full, and so that's how I cut my elastic. Then I'm going to just use a safety pin and clip it on the elastic. And now as I feed this through, I gotta find the one where I left the opening. There it is. I'm glad it's lace because you'll be able to see the pin. One of the challenges is you don't want your elastic to roll, and so I'm going to make sure that my pin is the same direction all the time, and I'm not going to let it twist. And now, a lot of times, since you have that seam allowance in there, you want to make sure your pin is going to go through and not get caught. Sometimes it can get caught on one edge like this and get stuck at the seam. So if you slightly tap on the top there, it kind of opens up that seam allowance, and you can gently just take that pin right through there. There we go. And gently pull it this way. And the edge of the elastic kind of sometimes will catch. But that way, here's the safety pin over here. We just smoothly went through where that seam allowance is. So I just kind of do that every time I come to where there's a seam. I just kind of gently tap, and then I work to make sure my pin is going all the way through, and then I adjust. Now, as you're working your way around, especially if you're a new sewer, the one thing you want to keep in mind as you're pulling this taut around is you don't want to pull all of your elastic inside the casing, because then you just have to pull it out and start all over again. And I've done it, but I'm going to be careful not to do it this time. So there, I'm pulling my fabric, but I'm not totally pulling it all the way taut because I don't want to lose this tail of elastic that's hanging here. I want some of that to still be out. So now as I finish my journey through the casing here and I smooth the fabric out, I'm not going to be pulling it all the way to the end because I want to leave this much of a tail. So then I'm coming to the last seam, I believe. There we go. Get through there. And now I'm going to come back out the opening, and I've been careful to make sure that my elastic is not rolling. So we'll take the pin off here. And so I know that this elastic is laying this way, so this is the front. And if it helps, you can put a little mark on here. So I know that this is the inside of the elastic, and then I know that the side that had the pin on it is the inside. So I want both of those little marks to be facing up. So now I'm going to pull this to give me a little bit more length to work with. And when I layer it, I want both of those to be the dots both on the top because they're both facing the inside of the garment. And I'm going to overlap about 1/2 inch. And now I'm going to take that to the machine. Get my pin out of the way here. And I'm simply going to sew those together by sewing and back tacking a couple times on that elastic to anchor it together. So here we go. So now when I pull the fabric this time, I'm going to be sure to have my elastic laying so that it will go in without twisting, and get up inside there. And I'm not going to totally adjust everything yet because I still want this to lay as flat as possible, so that now I'm going to run just that little opening in the machine so I can seal that up. And I just go to where there is sewing and sink the needle and do a little back tack, and then sew across the opening. And it's nice on the lace because you can see the elastic and know that you're not clipping the elastic because you can see it. So that's a benefit of lace leggings. There we go. And clip the thread on the back. Sorry, my hand's in the way. And now I just kind of pull it and work it so that that elastic is evenly distributed. And here we have the lace leggings. They're all done. So we'll put them on the doll and take a look. And here are the leggings on the doll. So I had someone ask me, they were looking at the pattern and they said, you must have a really long-legged doll because the pattern pieces are so long. And yes, she is very long-legged. And so this is like a low-rise pattern, so it goes to about here. Her waist is up higher. You can, if you want it to go all the way up at the top, you can always add more at the top. Or you could forgo the casing and sew on lingerie lace elastic at the top if you wanted that to go all the way up to the top rather than creating a casing. It's totally up to you. But then they come down, there we go, we'll spin around right to where her heel is. And since she is a high-heeled doll, then, you know, obviously there's going to be heels underneath. So that's how far down her leggings would go. And if she has boots or anything, it'll create that cute little wrinkle at the top that I don't mind having. So anyway, that's how they look. And as you can see, she doesn't have much on her tummy or even much of a bum. So that's why I wasn't worried about front and back being that different. But most of her shape comes from more width in the hips than several other of my dolls, and so that's the way that they're They're formed that way because they were made for this doll, which is the Angel Studio Huarong, just in case someone was wondering what doll it is. We'll do a little close-up on her face. I love her little face. So anyway, that's the doll. So now the next thing will be the jumper. Next is going to be the jumper, and this is going to be a very, very simple pattern to put together. And so I'm going to kind of go over it quickly and then just kind of put it together because, you know, it's just two pieces. So first off, I'm going to put right sides together, and I'm going to sew it together at the shoulder seams, and then I will probably top stitch those shoulder seams in place just to give it more strength. Then once that is done, I'm going to sew some binding around the neckline, and I'm going to use the method that will have the binding showing. And so I will sew the binding on, and I want the binding, the neck edge to be the actual seam line so that I can get it over her head, because if I leave it this narrow then it won't fit. So I'm going to do the wider opening method that we talked about earlier. Once that's done, I will also be putting binding on the arms in the same manner so that it will actually, the opening will actually be the seam line. Once the binding is around the neck and on the arms, then I will sew the side seams and then hem it. So that's what we're going to do here. It's pretty straightforward and simple considering how much time we spent on the blouse. It's a lot of the same steps, and we'll go ahead and get this done, and then I'll come back to the camera. And here is the jumper on the doll, and we'll take a look up here at the neckline. And I did find that happily, because this fabric is so thin and sheer, I just took the edge of the bias tape in a little bit from the edge of the fabric rather than worrying about cutting my fabric down. And because it's so thin, I was able to just fold it up inside the bias tape so that I could do that edge. But it made the armholes, excuse me, my voice is all froggy, the armholes in the neck hole big enough so that it did go over her head with no problems. And she has pretty broad shoulders, and the way her shoulders are put together, let's see if we can demonstrate this. Her arm doesn't really go up above her head very well because of right there, this cut of the shoulder, because it comes out farther, and it was still able to go over her head. So I was glad that the neckline worked because this is not stretchy fabric, and it still was able to go over her head. The next thing I want to look at and to take note of is the drape. So this is one of the things that I kind of went over in the last video, is that this pattern and the look of this pattern is so dependent on the drape of the fabric. Let's see if we can pull her a little bit forward. So see how this hangs? So this design is not intended to stick out like this. It's supposed to hang like this. So a lot of that is going to depend on what fabric you choose. And because this fabric is so thin and soft, it's able to hang down without having, you know, the Dutch gable at the seam side. So this is what the pattern was intended to do, is to hang very softly. I did try just to do a rolled edge on my serger, but because this fabric is so incredibly sheer, it just tore it and it wouldn't hem. And so I went ahead and just folded it up and did just a 1/4 inch hem on the edge, and it still hangs pretty well. I went ahead and pressed it, but a little bit of it got cut off just because of the serger and that attempt. But it's not supposed to be totally symmetrical anyway, so I think it won't hurt the way that the garment looks. So anyway, that's the way the jumper is supposed to fall. I'm very tickled with how this fabric performed, because it ended up falling exactly like I want. So hopefully she won't just fall off of there. But just see how that fabric flows and twists. That's exactly what it was supposed to do. So I'm very happy with how that turned out. So that is the 3 pieces. Again, let's see. We've got the jumper and the leggings, which turned out well. And then, of course, let's grab it, the little lace top. So these 3 are very, very sheer, and they're meant to be layered. And I thought you could even put this lace top on above the jumper if you want, just to keep the sleeves hanging right, or it could be underneath. So it just is versatile. You can kind of do whatever you want with those pieces. So that's the first 3 of this set. Thanks again for coming along and joining the channel, and we'll come back next time and we'll go ahead and tackle the skirt, the sweater, and the boot cuffs. So there we go. Oh, and the vest. We've got the vest to do. So a little bit more to do. We might do 1 more video or maybe 2, but we'll get this outfit finished up. And then also we'll show some variety of these pieces in other fabrics. So there you go. And until next time, happy sewing. Bye.